You have come to the Missing and Murdered Women, Indigenous Women Symposium. It's a sober topic, but we have a slate of inspiring speakers. I appreciate you coming. It takes a certain amount of courage to come just for a topic as serious as this. And we have weather and so forth. But welcome to all of you who made the effort. Tonight, we are talking about women in our lives. If you've ever seen a poster or a flyer on a pole or a tree of someone who is missing, that opens your eyes and your heart to the idea of loss and separation. Tonight, we are going to examine people who are often in the shadows. These are Native Indian women in Canada and the US who have been missing and murdered. 4/5 of women who are Native have experienced violence in their lives in some way. And the murder rate for Native women is 10 times the national average in the US. This connection is one that is a cause of sometimes isolation, sometimes social experiences of poverty or illness, but many times it is a result of systems that organizationally have reverberated from colonialism. This is a legacy we wish we didn't have, and at present, we share space and a future with colonists, with immigrants, and with Indigenous people. This is a future that we can shape, and I appreciate you coming to a topic that's so underscored with urgency and has such meaning for our future. As you came in, you saw the red dress exhibit. These vacant red dresses are representative of women in our lives who have vanished, and the red heart blood of women that connects us all is part of the symbolism. We have a single red dress here, representative of a woman in particular whose face we don't see, but whose concern we want to evoke tonight. I also have an empty chair, which is for Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who at present is voting, and we want her to complete her vote, and then she's en route to join us. The lineup for tonight will begin with Christopher Foley, who will inform us about the UN Declaration on Indigenous People and Human Rights. This declaration has formed our understanding and some of the language that shapes how we have approached really grappling with the phenomenon of people who take a picture around their neighborhood saying, have you seen this woman? Have you seen this girl? And with the instruments of the law and our social organization, we allow ourselves to give more productive voice as the Canadian inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And Qajaq Robinson is here to tell us about the commission report she has engaged in for 2 years, and Canada's report was released in June. So we will shape our understanding about an inquiry that gives voice to not just reports in a public or official forum, but from the voices of people who have experienced these and what it feels like for women in our lives to go missing. Deb Haaland then will join us to talk about activity in the U.S. and what our action can be now. As you came in, you may have met students with petitions. In your program, you also have a draft letter in case you would want to participate in that activism. I want to begin with something from my hometown, and that is a film clip of a movie. So I always thought if I had a hometown that was in a movie, it would probably be Washington, D.C. Instead, it's Wind River, Wyoming. This is a movie. I will show a brief glimpse of what it is like in Wyoming for a woman who is running, and then we'll see a brief trailer. And Jessica.
Oh, I don't know what happened to the running trailer. Give me 1 second. We might have to pull it up the old-fashioned way. Or let me begin with the trailer. There should be sound to this, but I'm not sure why the sound isn't working. We're just going to go right to...
Added to band's shopping list.
Peyton, what are you doing?
Nationwide's teamed up with Amazon to bring you the all-new Echo Auto. Alexa, add xylophone to band shopping list.
Okay.
We don't need a band shopping list.
Join Nationwide now and get a free Amazon Echo Auto.
There's a meadow in my perfect world, where wind dances the branches of a tree, casting leopard spots of light across the face of a pond. The tree stands tall and grand and alone, shading the world beneath it. every memory of you. And when I find myself frozen in the mud of the real, far from your loving eyes, I will return to this place, close mine, take solace in the simple perfection of knowing you.
Family's people were forced here, stuck here for a century. That snow and silence, it's the only thing that hasn't been taken from them. I need emergency assistance. The Wind River Indian Reservation.
I'm Jane Banner, FBI.
That's Corey Lambert. He's the one who found the body.
Didn't you people get the memo that it's spring?
Welcome to Wyoming.
How far do you think someone could run barefoot out here?
I knew that girl. She's a fighter.
This is a homicide.
You driving this vet around? That's what they asked me to do. It's not what I'm doing.
And what are you doing?
I'm a hunter. What do you think I'm doing?
You think there are multiple assailants? Should we just maybe wait for some backup?
This isn't a land of backup, Jane. This is a land of you're on your own.
Oh my God.
Wolves don't kill unlucky deer. You kill the weak ones.
You don't think I can make it?
Out here.
You cannot blink. Not once, not ever.
Hey! FBI!
Get your hand off that weapon!
Out here, you survive or you surrender.
Aside, this opens a view for how important place is for Indigenous people. It is a part of identity. And while we are familiar with the place we are in, Washington, D.C., places for Indigenous people are often vast and open. And understanding that is part of the understanding of the complexity. The other feature mentioned in this trailer is the matter of jurisdiction. So the FBI is part of the U.S. Program for all felonies that are separate from tribal jurisdiction. And some of the problems of murdered and missing Indigenous women do come from jurisdictional issues. And we'll get some insight into that as we understand the experience of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I'm happy to introduce you to our first speaker tonight, and that's Christopher Foley, who will talk to us about the UN Declaration on Indigenous Human Rights.
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, to Bette and to the other organizers of this event. It's a great honor to be here this evening. I'm very privileged to do this. My name is Chris Foley. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation down in Oklahoma, and I'm a staff attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center out in Helena, Montana. The center is a nonprofit law and advocacy organization that fights for Indigenous rights throughout the Western Hemisphere. So we work with Indigenous peoples on to advance our collective rights to land, self-government, self-determination, but also our individual rights to justice, to live lives free of discrimination and violence, including race discrimination and gender-based discrimination. I spend about half of my time working on a project called Safe Women, Strong Nations. This is a project where we work with tribal governments in the United States, as well as tribal organizations and indigenous advocates to end violence against Indigenous women. We do this work in a variety of ways. We do public education and outreach, things like this. We do a lot of law reform work, trying to change some of the jurisdictional problems that Bette mentioned, the laws that prevent tribal governments from protecting Indigenous women in their territories. And we and to do this work, a lot of what we do is we use international human rights advocacy as a tool to complement these efforts. We use international advocacy to pressure the United States to meet its legal obligations, its human rights obligations that it has assumed voluntarily. We use it to reach a different public audience, to reach different portions of the world and of America, to find new allies in our work, and to find new legal arguments in international law that we can use to advance domestic law reform, and to look for political strategies that are being successfully used elsewhere, like in Canada, things that we can bring back to do work here in the United States. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is a big topic, and I want to start by, when we say that missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW, I'll say as the common abbreviation, is a human rights violation, there's a bunch of stuff we have to unpack there to understand that. We need to know what we're talking about when we say MMIW. We need to know what human rights are, how they're violated, and maybe we need to know what advocacy work can be done around this issue. How can that help? How can international advocacy help to address this? MMIW is it's a constellation of things, right? There are individual crimes that we're talking about. We're talking about acts of violence committed by individuals against individuals. Assault, sexual assault, human trafficking, kidnapping, and murder. So we're talking about these individual crimes, but we're also talking about the systemic, these bigger drivers of these crimes. We're talking about like the local causes of these crimes, things like jurisdictional problems, these sort of technical law reform kinds of things. But then we're also looking at the fact that these crimes very often go unpunished. There's little or no criminal justice response to many of these crimes, especially in Indian country, but also in urban areas as well. So we need to look back at things like colonialism. We need to look at things like racism, at things like misogyny that are deeply integrated into the American legal system and that drive the response or the lack of response to this issue. So with these big picture things, when we're talking about colonialism in particular, what we're talking about is really the structure of U.S. law that works to deprive Indian nations, tribal governments, of authority to respond and protect Indigenous women. It takes criminal jurisdiction away from tribal governments and puts it at the state level or at the federal level, and then we have a system of government that doesn't actually enforce these laws, right? So tribes are precluded from responding to violent crimes in their territory when they're committed by non-Indians in most cases. Not all cases, but many cases. And the authorities that are responsible for responding, the federal government, the state government, choose not to. That is not an accident, right? These are deliberate policy choices. These are laws that have been passed by Congress. These are cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court. And it's part of, that's just colonialism. That's, how colonialism works. It's designed to take power away from tribal governments, from Indigenous peoples' governments, to destabilize them and delegitimize their governments so that they cannot function. That's how it's supposed to be. It's not a bug or a problem. It's that's how it is. That's what colonialism is about in the United States. So MMIW is an issue that includes, individual felonies, like I said, committed against individuals. But the causes of those crimes, both the immediate ones, the proximate ones about jurisdiction, and the deeper systemic or structural causes, like colonialism, in the ways that it's about the ways that colonialism then creates conditions of violence and it creates conditions of vulnerability. It makes Indigenous women more vulnerable. It creates a system of violence and it creates a system of impunity that prevents the prosecution and investigation of crimes in Indian country. missing and murdered Indigenous women is a human rights violation. So what are these human rights that are being violated, and where do we go to look for them? I don't have time to go into much detail at all, but that's okay. I'll talk in general about these things. The obvious place to look is the set of human rights treaties that have been adopted by the UN, that have been adopted by the OAS over decades, 75 years or so. And the important thing that I want to say tonight about these is that, human rights are at the center, at the very beginning of the reason that we have the UN, at the reason that we have the OAS. These international organizations were built not for trade, and they weren't built necessarily just for national security issues. They were built around human rights. They were built in response to the atrocities in World War II and the recognition that human rights violations are key to global safety and security, and that international organizations are needed to enforce human rights inside countries. We need an international organization that can look inside what's going on, what a government is doing to the citizens and the residents of their country and their territory, and respond to issues that arise there. So human rights are at the heart of the mission of the UN, of the OAS, from the very beginning. The UN Charter in 1945, the preamble, second paragraph, the UN Declaration, the United Nations has decided to establish itself to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women. So we have human rights at the core of what the UN is for, and we also have gender equality at the core of what the UN is for. The same picture holds true at the OAS. The Charter of the OAS says, the American states proclaim fundamental rights of the individual without distinction as to race, without distinction as to nationality, creed, or sex. The American Declaration on the Rights of Man, every human being has right to life, liberty. All persons are equal before the law without distinction as to race, sex, language, etc. So that's the Charter in the American Declaration in 1948. The UN Universal Declaration, the first big formal human rights statement from the UN, the same thing. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, race, color, gender, sex, rather. So the MMIW crimes that we're talking about, the specific felonies, and the MMIW systematic failures that we're talking about, the colonialism, the gender-based discrimination, and the racial discrimination that leaves these crimes unaddressed, right? These are both things that are at the heart of human rights. These are human rights issues from the beginning. Police failure, jurisdictional failures, federal law and policy failures. This is why we have the UN. This is why we have the OAS. That's what these institutions are for. Talking about domestic violence, talking about sexual assault, talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women at the UN, that's not some new thing that we're really stretching and reaching. We're making some tendentious argument about. It's what the UN is for. That's what the UN is about. That's what international law is for. International law has obviously, evolved and changed over the years. 1945 is a long time ago, and there's been a number of more specific instruments that address this field. The indigenous ones that I want to talk briefly about are the two declarations. We have a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we have the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples over in the OAS system. They're similar sorts of documents. They both set out minimum standards for the well-being of Indigenous peoples, and both documents contain non-discrimination provisions that we saw similar to what we saw in the UN Charter and the OAS Charter. We see gender discrimination provisions. The UN Declaration is very clear that Indigenous women have a right to live lives free of all forms of violence and discrimination. The American Declaration recognizes that. It goes a little bit further in some ways. It is more specific about intersectionality in the ways that the specific rights of Indigenous women and the specific rights of Indigenous peoples and the kinds of oppression and violence that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women face work together and compound together to create a more serious situation. So the American Declaration says we recognize that violence against Indigenous peoples and individuals, particularly women, hinders or nullifies the enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So racial equality, gender equality, the right to equal protection from the police, from prosecutors, equal protection from courts. These are the human rights that we're talking about when we're talking about MMIW, when we're talking about violence, race-based violence, and we're talking about race-based discrimination at the governmental level. So we have these violations. How do they, so these are the human rights in this topic area. The violations occur in a couple of ways. Two big ways that they happen, right? We have, international human rights law structurally is set up as, an agreement between the United States and Mexico and Canada and France, all the countries that sign these international human rights treaties, and it creates obligations between the states to enforce human rights standards domestically. Countries can violate human rights directly, and sometimes that's the sort of the archetypal human rights violation that we think of. We think of a country, a repressive regime, trampling on the rights of a minority group, executing political dissidents or something like that. That's one way that human rights get violated, and that happens in this field of MMIW as well. We can talk about systematic gender-based discrimination as a human rights violation committed by the federal government, because the federal government simply doesn't prosecute cases of murder against Indigenous women in a systematic way. We could make an argument about failure to investigate reports of missing women, again, as a gender-based violation. So there's direct violations like that. But international human rights law also recognizes that human rights can be violated, that states have an obligation of due diligence. They have an obligation to take care that private individuals also don't violate the principles of these human rights treaties. So there's an obligation to exercise due diligence by the United States to prevent, punish, investigate, or redress harm caused by private persons. So these individual acts of violence against Indigenous women, when we can argue that they are motivated by race, when we argue that they're motivated by gender, these also can come under these international law standards and be understood as human rights violations. Human rights in this context is not really, it's not that complicated. Treat women equally. Take precautions to protect, to enforce laws equally. Provide victim services. That's what this is coming down to. It's not a super complicated area, and it's what we can ask and what we can demand of our government. Our government has made these commitments, in signing international treaties, in endorsing the UN Declaration. The United States has said, yes, these are the standards that we accept. These are the standards we expect you, as citizens, to hold us to. This is what we're supposed to be doing. The legal responsibility, as I said, for violating international law, that tends to be a matter of ambassadors in Geneva talking to each other. That's kind of, like the U.S. and France is mad at the U.S. for breaking the International Human Rights Treaty. And that's important, and we can do that work. We can feed into that work as civil society in a variety of ways. But the real responsibility for human rights violation and for human rights enforcement is ours. It's a democracy, and it's us who do this, and it's our government that does these actions. It's our government that fails to protect Indigenous women. It's people that we elect. Human rights violation is made by policymakers who are making decisions. The systematic kind of things. It's about that. But human rights violations are also about individuals making choices. It's about a cop who's deciding whether he's going to take a missing report. A mom calls the police and says, my daughter's missing, and what does the cop say? Does the cop say, well, she could be at her friend's? That's what happens. That's a human rights issue right there, and that's something that that cop is responsible for, and it's something that we are responsible for to monitor and implement and encourage that our local officials, local level people, make different decisions, that they understand the obligations and they understand the ramifications of their actions, so that when when a Native woman is found murdered in the woods, and there's the coroner does an inquest, and the coroner has to decide what happened. That movie Wind River is partly about one of the plot points there is about this question. This woman is found dead, and the question is, was she murdered or did she just die? And that's an important, that's a huge question for the criminal justice system to decide, because that determines the course of action next. That says what happens next. And too often what happens is an Indian woman is found dead in the woods, and the police say, I don't know. Coroner says, can't tell. Too hard. Could be a heart attack. Let's just let it go, and we'll move on. We don't want to invest the resources. We don't want to spend the time. Why push it? We'll just file it away. And that happens all the time. That happens all the time. Finally, and briefly, just about international advocacy. Does it work? Can we use it effectively? And yes, we can. It works in a variety of different ways, and success it can come in different ways. Sometimes human rights are being violated because people, governments don't know what's happening, and they just need to be educated. They need to be, they need to understand that something matters. They need people, citizens, and NGOs, and activists to tell them that this matters. They need to know that it's happening. And people will change their minds. Sometimes that does happen. That's what advocacy is about. You present facts, you make an argument, and hopefully some people have their hearts open and some people can be changed. Sometimes. Sometimes, governments are just ashamed. They're embarrassed at the national, at the international level. They don't want to be labeled as a human rights violator for various reasons, for good reasons, genuine shame. Sometimes for practical reasons. They're worried about trade repercussions or reputational damage or something like that. So that happens. But the way that we see international advocacy working a lot more, I think, actually, and what we try and focus on is the way that we can use international advocacy to speak to other Americans about what's happening in Indian country and talk about the human rights violations that happen, about the fact that our women are going missing and our women are being murdered and no one is doing anything. And Americans are responsive to that sometimes. And Americans can hold the government responsible for these things sometimes as well. And that's the path that we saw in Canada, and I think that Qajaq will talk some about this, but Indigenous women in Canada were very effective at using international human rights mechanisms like the Inter-American Commission, like CEDAW, the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and other international human rights bodies to draw attention to the fact that MMIW is a human rights crisis in Canada, that it was a violation of international law, and they were able to place this on the national political agenda. And MMIW became a huge national political topic of conversation. And it became, it was a big factor in the election of Justin Trudeau. And Justin Trudeau thought, at least, or has acted as if it was a big part of his mandate, that his job was to address this human rights crisis. And, you will talk much more about whether that, how that has gone. But that's another example, and a very good example of how international advocacy can actually lead to results at the domestic level, because that's really what we're trying to do. It's fine to go to Geneva, and it's fine to talk, and it's fine to get the ambassador from France mad at the United States and talk about them at the Human Rights Council. That's awesome. But really what we need, right, are cops to act when our sisters go away. We need cops. And we need the government to give money to our government, to provide the resources, the criminal justice resources that we need to respond to these crimes. So that's what we have. And thank you all again, and that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, and that's a natural segue then for Qajaq Robinson, who will talk to us about Canada's experience.
Good evening. Before I begin, I do want to make a few acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the spirits of the women and the girls that have been lost to violence. I'm hearing myself twice. Are you hearing me twice? No? Okay. Oh. I also like to acknowledge that the fight for answers, justice, and equity continues. I also want to acknowledge that we are talking about what's happening today. I'm sure that for many of you, if you opened up your Facebook account, you'll see notices of girls missing, women missing, Two-Spirit people missing. That this isn't a discussion about things that happened in the past. This is happening right now, and it's getting worse. Often inquiries are done when you're looking at something retrospectively, and the National Inquiry in Canada was not about something that happened 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 5 days ago. As we went across the country, we held moments of silence in almost every community because they were looking for somebody. They were looking for a sister, a daughter, a mother, a cousin, a kukum. They were looking for their loved ones. They were looking for answers. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the National Inquiry. I've got a very short window, and I do feel like I'm scratching the surface, but I hope it gives you a bit of an idea of what has happened in Canada. Canada's National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People. We expanded it. Although the mandate from the government was women and girls, we recognize that in many Indigenous communities, the idea of male and female binaries is superficial. And we were also told by many members of the community that those who were gender diverse or two-spirited had been erased from the conversation, and that they experienced violence perhaps even higher or at the same rate. So we weren't going to close them out of the conversation. The inquiry was launched in 2016. 4 commissioners were appointed: Chief Commissioner Marion Buller, myself, Commissioner Odette, and Commissioner Ailfson. It was the first truly national inquiry. Each government, the federal and the 13 territories and provinces, have legal capacity to commission an inquiry. To have a truly national one where all those jurisdictions are under the microscope, it required jurisdictional coordination. So we actually had 14 mandates from the 14 governments giving us the authority to perform the inquiry. We released our report on June 3rd of this year. It's huge. It's 2 volumes with a supplementary report on our analysis with respect to genocide, and it contains over 230 calls for justice. The mandate that we were given by the 14 jurisdictions was to inquire and report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historic causes. To look at institutional policies and practices implemented in response to the violence, including those that have shown to be effective. We were asked to provide concrete and effective recommendations on how to remove those systemic causes and to provide ways to honor and commemorate those lost to violence. It was a systemic analysis. I think this is important to understand. This wasn't a study of Indigenous women and girls or Two-Spirit people. This was a study of Canadian systems and institutions, and more generally, Canadian society. We had some limitations, and this is something that I think is important and leaves a lot of unanswered questions. We were prohibited from making any types of conclusions about civil or criminal liability about individuals or organizations. We were also limited in that we couldn't do our work in a manner that jeopardized ongoing criminal investigations and criminal proceedings. Missing person cases are never closed, they're always ongoing. Unsolved murder cases are not closed, they're always ongoing. This provided some limits, and we ended up in court fighting with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to try and access some of those files, those unsolved cases, to find out where things went wrong systematically, and the door was shut on us. So there's many answers that are still required, specifically in individual cases. As Chris indicated, there were a number of events that pushed Canada to the point where an inquiry had to be held. The advocacy of Indigenous women, girls, families, survivors, and grassroots organizations cannot be underestimated. They were literally kicking down the doors of their leadership, of national and regional governments and representative bodies, demanding that this issue be recognized and looked at. There were significant reports in 2012, 15, as well as 2015. Canada held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission looking at the impacts of residential school, or what is commonly known as boarding schools in the US. And in their calls for action, they called on the federal government to establish a public inquiry to look at the causes and remedies for the disproportionate victimization of Indigenous women. There was also a report in 2015 by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and a report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, all looking at and identifying this issue as a human rights issue. In total, I can't even remember how many reports there were that predated our inquiry that we could rely on. And I will give credit to the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments. They gave us the authority to rely on those reports. So our work was really building on what had been done by international bodies as well as Indigenous women's groups. We knew we had to center our work in the lived experience and the voice of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. Our objective was to find the truth by gathering their stories, by learning about their encounters with the system and different institutions. Their encounters would weave together the tapestry that showed everyone what violence against Indigenous women really looks like in Canada. As I said, this is not a study of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people. It's a study of the systems through their encounters. And we measured these encounters using Indigenous rights and human rights instruments, a human rights and Indigenous rights lens, measuring the Canadian state up against the laws that it had signed on to or enacted themselves. Our methodology was quite simple. Hear from the families first. In the truth-gathering process, we went across the country and we heard from over 2,000 families directly and survivors. We heard from close to 800 through artistic expression. Some didn't want to talk. Some didn't want to talk publicly. They could speak privately. Some didn't want to use words. They used art, and we received those gifts and learned from them. We moved into part 2 and 3, which were our expert and knowledge keeper hearings, as well as institutional hearings, where we took the key themes and institutions and systems identified by the families and survivors in part 1, and we dissected them further. We had hearings on policing, sexual exploitation, on the child welfare system, on colonial violence, and on human rights and Indigenous laws, to name a few. At the same time, we reviewed past and current research and performed a forensic document review, examining police files from across the country to see where there were systemic failures and issues that could be addressed and identified. This is where we ran into problems with the police forces. We did, however, obtain quite a few and were able to find some problems that we were able to identify. One of the most important things in how we did our work, however, was in engagement with knowledge keepers, elders, and people with lived experience. We were guided by our grandmother's circle, our elders' circle, every step of the way. Also our National Family Advisory Circle, which was made up of families and survivors and grassroots folks that worked with us, held our feet to the fire, and held us accountable the whole way. We also recognized that too often Indigenous people are lumped into this homogenous group. And there's populations and communities, even within Indigenous communities, that have been exceptionally marginalized. So we made sure we had we made special efforts and had specific committees and hearings with Inuit women, Métis women, 2S. Quebec has often been excluded, and incarcerated Indigenous women and girls. Throughout, we held 3 key principles: families and survivors and community first, doing things in a trauma-informed way, trying to make it a process that could be healing as well, and trying to be decolonizing, trying to center Indigenous ways of doing and knowing in the process. Our findings at the end of the inquiry, after hearing from all the families and examining all the research, was quite simple, and Chris alluded to it. It's colonialism. Colonialism and colonization is an act of violence. It's been experienced by Indigenous women historically as well as today. The impacts of colonialism, the disruption it causes at a family, nation, individual level is the root cause of all the other forms of violence that Indigenous women are subjected to as well. To read specifically from the first finding of fact within our report, The root cause of the disappearances, murders, and violence experienced by Indigenous women is the significant, persistent, and deliberate pattern of systemic racial and gendered human rights violations and Indigenous rights violations and abuses, perpetuated historically and maintained today by the Canadian state, designed to displace Indigenous people from their lands, social structures, and governance, to eradicate their existence as nations, communities, families, and individuals. And to us, it amounts to genocide. When we look at the types of human rights and Indigenous rights violations that we heard of most frequently in the course of the inquiry, 4 key areas came through. Chris touched on the issue of the right to justice. This was a huge one. In police files we reviewed, it showed that far too often police relied on stereotypes and misconceptions to guide their investigative work, not evidence. And worse, they erased the fact that this violence was being experienced by Indigenous women by failing to record the identity and nationhood of the women. So when we look at those shocking statistics, in Canada, Indigenous women make up 2% of the population. 2% of the population, between 20 and 25% of murdered women in Canada are Indigenous women. And those are only whose status is recognized by the state agency or who is documented. And if you are a trans Indigenous woman, you do not get on that data set. We're also talking about violations of rights to culture, health, wellness, and social security. I could spend hours on each of those 4 areas. But one of the key things that we also discovered and came to understand more fully is that there's 4 key ways that this pattern is allowed to persist. We can't ignore the impact of trauma, the intergenerational and compound trauma that makes this violence persist. That, coupled with the deliberate economic marginalization of Indigenous people, specifically Indigenous women. Boarding schools, residential schools were not designed to allow people to enter into the economy. They were designed to assimilate and subjugate, and that has to be recognized. The denial of the political rights of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as well is part of the pattern that maintains this. Their agency and expertise is denied and erased. Finally, the lack of political and institutional will. And this is what's scary, because political will and institutional will is often governed by citizens of a state. And if citizens of a state aren't pushing institutions to act, we are in a scary place. I'm going to talk about some of our key calls for justice and our final report. We rejected the idea that we were providing recommendations. We held Canada up to its own mirror, its own laws, and we assessed them, their behaviors, their institutions, how they treat and serve Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, and we gave them back a report card on how they are lifting up and upholding their own laws. So they're not recommendations, they're calls for justice. The calls for justice are designed to build a foundation that allows Indigenous women and girls to reclaim their rightful power and place, to ensure compliance with international and domestic human rights and Indigenous rights, laws and instruments, and that these rights be recognized, protected, and enjoyed by Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. Issues around accountability and mechanisms for recourse is tremendous. There needs to be the establishment and the enhancement of meaningful, accessible accountability and recourse mechanisms, some of these English words. The Canadian justice system needs, especially police oversight and accountability, needs tremendous reform. But there also needs to be, and we called for the establishment of a national Indigenous human rights ombudsperson and tribunal. We called on all those with jurisdiction, recognizing that Indigenous governments hold jurisdiction as well, to establish a national action plan, to report on it within parliaments annually. This coordinated action plan is required specifically because of the interjurisdictional either tensions or voids that exist. There's a whole lot of passing, like, this is my jurisdiction, not yours, or completely playing hot potato. So you end up with these voids. And this is particularly true in the area of child welfare, health services, education, corrections, the list goes on. People either want to take it on and do it all themselves, or they don't want to do it at all. Finally, another big issue that we call for action on is in relation to the collection of accurate, culturally specific, and comprehensive data. We are only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and if we're going to be able to recognize what is truly happening, and if we're going to monitor implementation, but also progress, ensuring the health and well-being, the political, social, economic, cultural rights of Indigenous women and girls are upheld, we need to have that data. Our report was received on June 3rd. Full disclosure, it got leaked and people got really mad a week before, and it was all over the news even before we got a chance to say anything, particularly on our conclusion that this amounted to genocide. However, the final report has been accepted by the 14 jurisdictions. None have taken us to court for anything that we said, and they had the power to do so, so that says something. I would say that with respect to how it's been received by Indigenous organizations, grassroots women's organizations, and families and survivors, I think that it's been a tremendously validating process, and the report a validating outcome. I won't say that it's universally accepted, but it's, I think, for many seen as a good start and a good tool. The Prime Minister of Canada received our report on the 3rd, and the next day accepted our findings, including accepting that we had found that the Canadian state's actions and inactions in relation to MMIWG-2S amounted to genocide. This is significant. He's using the word. He is couching it that in the language of, I accept that you find it. He's not necessarily saying that he agrees. But a former Supreme Court judge was at a conference with a friend of mine a couple weeks ago, and she very publicly said that she felt that the arguments were quite persuasive and thinks it's time to start acting accordingly. I'm going to finish off with a bit of an overview of what I've seen come down the pipe since the release of the report. Recognizing it was only a few months ago, we've had a federal election in between the release of the report and now, and it was summertime. You know what happens in the summertime when it comes to government and leadership. That said, I think that the process as well as the report has been an empowering tool for many grassroots people, organizations, and individuals. I'm seeing it being used as a tool to get at tables of power across the country. I'm seeing Indigenous women's groups take the report and use it to assert their leadership, showing up at police stations and police boards saying, this is what you need to do, and we'll do it in partnership with you. The government of Canada has pledged to an action plan and is mobilizing with Indigenous groups as well as Indigenous women's groups and people with lived experience to start developing the plan for development. We talked a lot about process in our report, and the days of unilateral, patronizing, we'll fix it for you is done. The solutions rest with Indigenous people, their communities, their cultures, and their ways of being and doing. So anything that's done has to be with them. The government of Canada has committed to this, and there's signs that they are mobilizing. There's been some legislative reform. The gender discrimination within the Indian Act as it relates to status has been eliminated. The criminal code nationally has been amended to recognize violence against an Indigenous woman as an aggravating factor in sentencing, and this is significant. The British Columbia legislature, one of our provinces, has tabled legislation to harmonize and domesticate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. When passed, this law will require that the province ensures that all their laws are in harmony with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this is significant. The federal government has passed federal child family services legislation that does a number of things. First, they co-developed this with Indigenous groups nationally, and this is significant. It went to Parliament with the support of Indigenous peoples, and this is key. This act recognizes inherent jurisdictions of Indigenous peoples, Inuit First Nations, and Métis. It also establishes mechanisms to support the exercise of this jurisdiction. Another significant step has been some language within the jurisprudence of our courts. This spring, I think it might be a couple of days before the release of our report, the Supreme Court of Canada released its decision in the Barton case, which involved the violent killing of an Indigenous woman. In this case, at the trial level, she was repeatedly referred to as the native prostitute, never questioning whether or not those two facts had anything to do with the trial and proved relevant in any way, shape, or form. Specifically coming from the Supreme Court, and we intervened in the Supreme Court and gave submissions, but the court put an onus on all lower courts to take active steps to ensure and address bias, prejudice, and stereotypes in these types of cases. And what is significant about this case is it does put onus on the judges, and it does require judges to make special instructions to juries. But in the judgment, the Supreme Court identified specific examples of bias and prejudice and stereotypes that had to be actively rejected. The fact that these types of stereotypes could be articulated by a panel of predominantly white men shows you how pervasive they are. The court said that the judges must ensure that ideas that an Indigenous woman is not entitled to the same protections under Canadian law must be rejected, that somehow they're not deserving of respect, humanity, or dignity, or that they're somehow sexual objects for male gratification, and the list goes on. The court identified them and called on all lower courts to reject them. There are a number of other steps that have been taken, and I think that I, in my pessimism, still hold my breath. But I have confidence in the Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in Canada that they will not let the door shut on this. And the solutions continue to lie with them. And I hope to continue to be an ally and an accomplice in doing so. If we have time, I have a short video. Do we have 4 minutes?
We'll take 4.
Okay. As I said, we worked with the National Family Advisory Circle that guided us throughout the way to make sure we were doing things in a good way. At the end of the inquiry, they wanted to produce a video to share with the country, and now I think the world. So I'd like to play that because their hopes, their truth, I think captures everything. Thank you.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Anna Lasta.
I am my daughter.
I
am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women,
girls, two-spirited, and trans people.
We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found.
And we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears.
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
to tell their stories.
Pour partager la vérité.
Our ancestors protected our ways
so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace.
In peace, friendship, and trust.
La paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity,
abundance, and well-being.
La confiance brisée a érodé.
Broken trust has eroded this relationship.
jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls.
Nos femmes et nos filles.
We are here to restore their dignity
and forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians,
to stand with us.
To stand with us.
In ending all forms of violence.
Learn about the truthful,
la vraie histoire
of the relationship between First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
By upholding their rights.
And respecting our sisters.
Et en respectant leurs valeurs.
Our language.
Our treaties, and our way of life.
With clean water, housing, and safety.
And respecting our women, our children, and our families.
Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés.
By becoming allies and advocating for change needed.
I love you, baby.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten.
I am here to speak for those who cannot speak.
Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous?
I am a change maker. Are you?
Congresswoman Haaland, she's en route, but while we are absorbing this, I'd like to open the floor for a couple of questions before we really get into what the U.S. is doing in response to American Indian, Alaska Native women and children. There are mics on each side of the aisles if you care to step forward and ask any questions of our two panelists.
Marjorie Mansell-Balzer, Georgetown. Thank you both for these important presentations. Chris, I had a question for you, if you could elaborate on the word intersectionality and the degree to which, I know it's a big issue, but the degree to which what these cases mean also cross-sect with so many other issues important to Indigenous people.
Intersectionality is it's a bit of a buzzword. It's something that people have been using a lot in recent years. It's a newish bit of vocabulary, and it tends to be, the way I use it and the way I was talking about it there is talking about the ways that different systems of oppression overlap and reinforce each other and result in even worse outcomes. So Indigenous women face intersectional discrimination because they are women and because we live in a patriarchy that discriminates against women. And they experience discrimination because they are Indigenous, and we live in a racist society that discriminates against Indigenous peoples. And often they experience discrimination because they're poor or because they have a lack of education or other resources. And all of those systems together reinforce each other, and they make each other stronger. They make the discrimination and they intensify the discrimination that Indigenous women feel and live in their lives. So that's kind of what intersectionality is in a practical sense. And the American Declaration, I was just thinking of this tonight when I was preparing, that article in the American Declaration really does get at that issue in a way that shows an advance in thinking, a change in thinking from the UN Declaration. It wasn't quite there yet in these earlier documents, but the American Declaration really recognizes that Indigenous women experience this in particular, in a specific way that happens because they're Indigenous and because they're women. So that's kind of the short answer there, I think.
case of Canada, absolutely. In our review of investigative files, we found that in police investigations, the reliance on stereotypes was pervasive, and it guided how investigations were conducted as opposed to facts and as opposed to evidence. It is also clear in our judicial system, and I think that one case before the Supreme Court of Canada is the hallmark, where we had it was actually the prosecutors who were prosecuting the killing of this Cindy Gladue that introduced the language of native prostitute. It wasn't defense counsel. It wasn't witnesses. It was in the opening remarks by prosecutors that this type of language that evokes all sorts of racial and occupational and gender stereotypes that just flooded the entire process. And the Supreme Court speaks to it being widespread and pervasive in the system, criminal justice system, as well as in our society, and because of that specifically put an onus on the courts to take special measures to try and remove that. Will that be successful? I think that that kind of learning has to happen everywhere. It can't just be in the hands of a judge to say, well, you can't assume that because she's Indigenous and was engaged in sex work that she was assuming the risk of this kind of violence. We need to go deeper. But in Canada, yes, when it comes to cases of violence, intimate partner included. I had one narrative, and I don't necessarily think that there's qualitative, but this idea that, well, you know, it's normal in this community, the normalization. We heard in many testimonies how the normalization of the violence then becomes an excuse for the inactivity of law enforcement officers.
My respect to all three of you, and my respect to all those missing and murdered. My name is Morgan Santoro. I'm a professor here at Georgetown, and I'm also on the administrative council of the Institut of Amériques. That is a sponsor of this evening's event, for which I'm very grateful. I'm also Anglophone-Canadian from the West Coast, grew up in a territory that was formerly belonging to the First English people, brought up in recognition of their presence on that territory, and now as a faculty member here, I'm trying to draw attention to Indigenous stories in the ways that I can. I specialize in Indigenous cinema for Quebec. All this to say, I don't think I have necessarily more legitimacy, but I have conviction and engagement, which is obviously what you have as well. And to the point, a lot of what needs to happen can't happen without money, without support of various forms. And I'm wondering perhaps from both of you where that money might come from and how that might be channeled to affect the change that obviously needs to happen.
Chris, you want to take it first?
Sure. Absolutely. You know, in the United States, in Indian country, on reservations, basically, you know, the justice systems are underfunded and under-resourced by an enormous. You know, I think that the statistic is, I think it's like they're funded at less than 10% of the need in the federal government. So the funding for tribal justice systems in the United States under our system of government, under federal Indian law principles, comes from the United States. The United States has a trust responsibility to support Indian governments, to support Indigenous tribal governments in the United States. That is the result of that's kind of the deal that the United States made. They take all the land, they commit genocide, and the response is that they have to do some things in return, and they have to, and providing government services is one of them, including justice services. So there's a variety of technical, bills going forward, ways to sort of increase the guaranteed money for tribes in the way that the federal government provides funds for crime victims, for instance. There's a federal law that distributes certain monies that is taken from criminal penalties and spends it on crime victim services. There's a federal law about that has a set aside for tribal governments that says tribal governments get 5%. And there are bills to improve that, to increase that amount, to better reflect the actual needs in Indian country. And there are similar, a lot of funding work being done on the Hill. And I usually leave that to some of my more expert colleagues, and I certainly don't have the notes with me tonight to be more specific. But it's absolutely the case that money is needed for tribal governments to do this work, and for local governments and state as well. I mean, sometimes there's state responsibility, sometimes there's federal responsibility, and especially at states, one of the big problems is they have responsibility and no funding for law enforcement in Indian country, so they don't do it. And some of that is because they're bad, right? And some of it, a lot of it though, is also just because they don't have the resources. They can't tax Indians, they can't tax Indian land, and they don't get money from the feds to provide cops, so they don't. And that can be fixed by federal law reform.
In Canada, I struggle with this question because the reality is when it comes to funding of Indigenous cultures, Indigenous languages, Indigenous education, child welfare on reserve, and for Indigenous children, they're funded less. There's not even equality, let alone substantive equality. You know how much a government is serious about reaching substantive equality and eliminating structural discrimination when you see how their budgets are outlined, what they prioritize putting money in. There's money there. I mean, the fact that we've got communities in Canada that are surrounded by gold and diamond mines, yet they don't have clean running water, tells you something. The royalties are going to the state for that. The taxes are going to the state for that, state being Canadian state and provincial. The money's there. It's governments deciding how it's spent. So yeah, it'll cost money. And to achieve substantive equality and to ensure that Indigenous people share the same and enjoy the same rights as non-Indigenous Canadians, more money will have to be spent. And do it. Find it. Maybe shut down the Senate. Maybe fewer fancy planes for politicians. Maybe smaller budgets for those big gatherings they hold. There's places where we can cut and put towards Indigenous children instead. I don't mean to be harsh, but I get irate when the money is taken from stolen lands in many cases.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's take your question.
Good night. Good evening. I'm from the Maya Mum Nation in Guatemala, and I want to acknowledge that we're on Piscataway Nation territory. And of course, missing and murdered Indigenous women is a situation throughout all of the continent. I think there were a lot of things that were discussed that when we think of this as a hemispheric issue, as a global issue, one of the things that I didn't really hear where it might have come from in the work is the relationship with women defending lands and territories and being persecuted, disappeared, and murdered. If we look at the situation right now in South America, in Central America, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, and the number of women who are being murdered connected to our lands and territories, I think that's a piece of the conversation that needs to happen. Another thing that we've seen a lot in the border has been the number of Indigenous women and children and girls who are being disappeared in the process of crossing borders. Many of us have run for our sisters as well. And so as we talk about this conversation, I think it's really important that it's not just within the context of the United States and Canada, which is absolutely critical that we honor all of the women that have lost their lives in the United States and Canada. But as we know, colonial governments crossed all of our ancestral lands and territories, and all of us women are suffering those consequences. And so as this work continues, there is also a global need for solidarity between us as Indigenous sisters across our different nations in Turtle Island, in Abya, Yala, or Ishimule, or however we call our ancestral territories. So I really want to thank you for your work because it's so critical in defending the lives of our women and also the life of Mother Earth.
That's beautifully and poetically stated, and I should say, in acknowledgement of the committee that worked with me on this, that the idea of the shared experience within the Western Hemisphere, but especially across borders, is one that we certainly acknowledge. So we have the chance for information tonight and hopefully engagement for the future. We have our final panelist, a special guest, is Congresswoman Deb Haaland from New Mexico, who has arrived to talk to us about the United States response to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Please help me welcome Congresswoman Haaland.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for having me. And this is absolutely proper because it's Native American Heritage Month. Can you all see me okay? How about if I just open this up a little bit more? There you go. I'm hiding behind the computer screen. So a warm welcome to you all. Especially Georgetown University and the Institut des Amériques for hosting this event. Commissioner Robinson of Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Mr. Foley with the Indian Law Resource Center, and Professor Jacobs with the Health Systems Administration. My name is Deb Haaland. I am a member of the Laguna Pueblo and very proud to represent the 1st District of New Mexico as one of the first 2 Native American women ever elected to Congress in our country's history. So thank you. I'm so honored to be part of this discussion with our distinguished panelists as we continue to raise awareness on the silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. It's also important to note that the violence that Indigenous women face is not isolated to this country, but has spread to our sisters across North America and in South America and countries such as Honduras and others. I thank all of you for the professional research you have worked on and completed. Canada leads the way in this important issue, and I look forward to learning more as time goes on. This is one of many conversations I know we'll have with all of you. My staff and I will do our best to take your research and inform policy going forward. As we all know, the best policy is informed by research, and you have done a stellar job in this respect, and we'll work together to make the next critical steps in finding the solutions to a crisis that was centuries in the making. The missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis is not isolated to women and girls, but severely impacts our Two-Spirit people and transgender women as well. In Honduras, at least 97 transgender people have been murdered since 2009, and in Guatemala, there have been 5 transgender women killed during a 5-month period in 2017. In my district in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 3 transgender Navajo members were murdered within the last 10 years. These rates are likely much higher since law enforcement at the state and federal levels don't necessarily track victims' tribal affiliation, and because communications between law enforcement agencies is spotty at best. To fully understand this issue, the knowledge of the historical context is critical. The issue has plagued Indigenous communities since the late 1400s, when Europeans came here and began to inflict hundreds of years of racism and genocide against Indians, which of course included severe violence against Native women. It has been a little over 500 years since this silent crisis began, and we have seen this horrific narrative normalized in American culture through romanticized depictions of Native American women like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, who were kidnapped away from their homes and their people and used to depict as normal sad and brutal relationships. The true betrayal is that our society, after all this time, continues that lie. When we speak of this crisis, we must speak for all those who have passed, including those images hanging in plain view at the Capitol. Right now in our nation's Capitol Rotunda, life-sized oil paintings depict artistic images of the founding of the United States, which essentially show the conquest by the colonizers and the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans through illustrations of baptisms and fearful, naked Native women. On the same wall hangs a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document that states that all men are created equal, but 30 lines below that starkly refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. Unsurprisingly, there is no Native representation in the Declaration of Independence painting, even though the Iroquois Confederacy largely influenced its writing. The painting was installed in 1826, which is further symbolic of the MMIW artwork in the Rotunda, and ironically, Andrew Jackson was elected as president 2 years after its installation. During his presidency, Andrew Jackson was successful in his Indian removal policies, leading to the Trail of Tears, one of the Native American genocides where our ancestors were marched over 1,000 miles to be imprisoned in military camps, where many of the women and children were raped and murdered. To put all of this history into perspective, it has been 243 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed, 230 years since the first United States Congress met, and 193 years since the paintings in the Rotunda were hung. However, it has only been 11 months since my sister Sharice Davids and I were elected as the first Native American women ever to serve in Congress. It has taken Native women over 240 years to finally hold a congressional seat in the United States Congress, where we can finally ensure that this MMIW crisis is talked about and acted upon, so it doesn't continue to be a silent crisis any longer. In our communities, missing and murdered Indigenous women has never been silent. It has been passed down through generational trauma from the genocide era to the many failed federal policies, and thus a neglect of the U.S. government's trust obligations through severe underfunding for public safety, education, housing, and health care. It has impacted many family members and friends, but little has been done over time to combat these larger issues. When I first decided to run for office, I did so with the intent of bringing much-needed representation to Indian country and to the issues that have plagued our communities since Europeans first arrived. Whether or not you belong to Indian country, if you're sitting in this room, you likely know that Native women are disproportionately affected by violence compared to any other demographic across the United States today. This is why I have worked so hard to shed light on these issues and introduce legislation this Congress to help promote healing in our communities. Among the most crucial pieces of legislation that I have brought forward is the Not Invisible Act of 2019, the first bill introduced by 4 federally recognized tribal members this year in Congress. This bill works to form an advisory committee comprised of law enforcement, tribal leaders, survivors, and their family members to inform Congress so that we will produce the legislation that is relevant and necessary. Additionally, I co-sponsored an updated version of Savannah's Act, which will work to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women cases by increasing coordination and communication between state, federal, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies to improve the collection of data and statistics related to the missing and murdered. My two most recent bills are the Badges Act and the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act. I worked with amazing advocate and ally Senator Tom Udall on the Badges Act, which will streamline the BIA tribal officer hiring process, establish federal grants to combat the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, and improve federal data sharing for missing and unidentified Indigenous people. Similarly, Senator Elizabeth Warren and I are currently working together on the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act. This will be a comprehensive bill that closely follows the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report to address the chronic underfunding in Indian country across all federal agencies that has been present for many, many decades. This legislation is significant because it aims to reaffirm the trust responsibility and specifically addresses the chronic budgetary shortfalls to combat the silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women through properly funded public safety in Indian country. Native women and girls should not have to fear that no one will act if something should happen to them. And I just would like to mention at this juncture that the House had passed the Violence Against Women Act back in April, and it is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. He is not passing it. He's not putting it to the floor. He's not allowing the senators in his chamber to vote on the Violence Against Women Act, of the Reauthorization Act of 2019. And so I think that's shameful, and I just thought I'd share that with you. Funding resources for Indigenous women and girls is quite literally a matter of life and death. It will take a profound and unanimous effort to dismantle this destructive cycle and corrosive narratives, but I am hopeful that we will see a change. I'll leave you with some well-known statistics on gender-based violence against Native American women and a question that I would like each of you to think about. Compared to the national average, Native women are 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. 50% have suffered from sexual violence. More than 80% have survived serious violence during their lives, and 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other group of women in the United States. 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other group, and a majority of these cases are ignored by authorities. Now, here's my question for you. If half of all women currently living in Washington, D.C. were victims of sexual assault and face murder rates at 10 times the national average on a daily basis, what do you think the public response would be? Thank you all so much for having me here this evening, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Question and answer, if you would care to step to the microphone and address the panelists.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. I am still affected by the last question that was asked, and Congresswoman, I remember the great op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times saying that while Trump may not welcome immigrants, Native Americans have a different view. And so I just wanted to invite those of you on the panel to kind of reflect or share your thoughts on the last question that was asked about potential solidarities between Indigenous communities here and people who are often represented to us as racialized immigrants, but who also are Indigenous to this continent, right?
Deb, would you take that first?
I'm not quite sure I I understand fully the question you're asking. Would you like to just, yeah. I just want to make sure that I answer it properly. The question about, the question that I asked in my piece, or what, because I came in a little late, so maybe it's a question that I didn't hear. So or are you talking about the fact that we're not, that all women have been affected by this?
Well, a lot of people who are coming to the border and who are facing, you know, all kinds of humiliation and violence at the border are Indigenous women who have been displaced by related histories of colonialism, and who are also victims of what is called a femicide, you know, in parts of Central America. And so that question, I think, your comment, I think, raised a question about potentials for solidarity, right, among Indigenous activists in the United States and Canada and others.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. For some reason, I came in when she was asking the question and didn't. I understand now. No, I think we do need to have solidarity. Having been from being a New Mexican, the Spanish came to New Mexico from the south in the late 1500s. So you had Europeans, you know, who came to the East Coast, but then there were also the other side of the country at the same time was experiencing colonization at the same time. So we absolutely have to think about the fact that the borders were not even there until the people in office decided that they should be there, right? After a few wars and after, you know, whatever political issues were happened, Native Americans, they didn't have any input in deciding where any of these borders would be. And if you think about, you know, one of the largest, you know, issues with respect to this was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that actually made, you know, cut the southern borderline. And that's what caused, like, some Indian tribes now to be half in Mexico and half in the United States. So I believe that we absolutely do need solidarity because if you're an Indigenous person, those borders did not exist for your ancestors and for people before us. And it doesn't make us, just because the borders are there, it doesn't mean that we failed to be Indigenous to the same land that our ancestors have cared for centuries and centuries. So I absolutely see the relevance in us communicating and working together to combat this issue, and which is why I mentioned South America in my speech. And of course, I really have a strong, I guess, I am fighting as hard as I can also for the LGBTQ community, but trans women are targeted at an alarming rate. Not only in this country, but mostly in South America. There are countries that have no tolerance for anyone who is different. And that's not how Indigenous people were. We accepted people for the way they were. If they were, I mean, we didn't, you know, we didn't have all these gender biases, and people were who they were, and they were accepted by their tribes for who they were. This whole gender bias issue, that's relatively new because none of our tribes operated on that idea. And so now when people are targeted in that way, that's not who we are as Indigenous people, and we need to speak up and stand up for everyone who is being victimized in that way.
Chris, could you comment about the UN Declaration and how that might inform this part of the conversation?
Sure. I think one of the virtues of international human rights law is that it talks in universal terms. It talks about the rights of indigenous peoples, not just federal Indian law talking about citizens of federally recognized tribes, or some laws recognize state recognized tribes, or maybe Indian children who aren't really a citizen of any tribe but could be. We have federal laws that protect these categories. International human rights law gets at all of indigenous peoples. It says that indigenous peoples have the right to live lives free of violence. Indigenous peoples have rights to cross borders, to be in contact with their fellow citizens in other countries, and recognizes rights of immigration, these sorts of things. So I think that international human rights law is a very valuable tool when we're talking about border crossing issues, when we're talking about the violence that's happening in the border, because we have violations of federal law that we can talk about for the United States, violating constitutional rights that apply to immigrants, but it's also violating human rights that apply to everybody who's here, whether or not you're a citizen, whether or not you are a criminal, or whatever the situation is. Human rights apply to everybody here in the territory. That's how human rights law works. That's how international human rights law works. So it's a very valuable tool, I think, to hold the United States accountable for the violence that we are, as a country, that we are inflicting on our sisters and our brothers who are coming here looking to work. They're looking for safety. They're looking to better their lives, to protect their families. So.
Trying to be nice to everybody so we could all hear. My name's Erica Sitting Up. I'm originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm Dene and Lakota. I'm actually kind of fairly new to this whole movement. I have lots of sisters that are really deep into it, and that's kind of why I'm here, because I want to spread what is, what you guys are talking about here to them. And what has stood out to me, there are several questions I have, believe me, and maybe one day they will be answered and I can help in any way I can. But what kind of stands out to me as a solution, rather than talking about the past and all these things, is that I feel to smash stereotypes, because I feel like that's where it kind of stems from, as you are saying, is there any plans in all these acts that you're trying, Congresswoman, to have the local government and the state government have better relations with the tribal police, as far as maybe educating them more, not just, okay, this is how you do this, but more education on who we are as peoples and what we believe in, and just so that way, kind of like in the Black Lives Matter movement, they kind of were starting to do that. We're trying to train the police people or police about not to have those prejudices. And I feel like that is besides money, I feel like that's the other issue. So I guess my question to you, Congresswoman, is there going to be more of that, as far as, possibly the tribal, the police even taking classes or helping? I just feel like there should be more of a, connection between the two, a strong connection, not just, I think it's kind of severed to a point, or nobody really knows. Like you were saying, there's a jurisdictional thing too, which that was another question I had, because why aren't the FBI stepping up more when it happens on tribal lands?
Right. So there's a lot of pieces. What we're trying to do essentially is to mandate that there is communication between all these law enforcement agencies. They don't even they're not even on the same, I don't know what it's called because I'm not a technical person. The same, radio waves or whatever it is, right? So there's a couple things. We want them to be able to share information. That's absolutely essential. But there's a lot of other moving pieces, right? It's and we're working on all of it. So I like to use the example of, in my district, if I were standing in the middle of the Navajo Nation and somebody were ready to assault me and I pulled out my cell phone to call for the police, I wouldn't get a signal. I wouldn't be able to call anybody. Who would come and help me, right? That's one of the issues a lot of women face. So we need to make sure that communities are connected to the internet, to cell phone service, that when they call someone, somebody can respond. The other issue is that if you're a tribe that has your own police department, that's one thing. If you're a tribe that doesn't have your own police department and you rely on the Bureau of Indian Affairs police, and maybe you're one of 12 tribes that rely on the BIA police, and there's only 2 or 3 police officers patrolling, you know, a 300-mile radius, how long do you think it would take you to get a BIA police out to help you if you called in a 911 emergency? And not only that, if you called 911 and you had cell service, where would that call go? Would it go to the local police in the city down the road, or would it actually go to the tribal police? Or, I mean, these are all issues that we need to figure out and make them work for citizens of Indian country, because it's like there's so many things that need to be done, and that's part of the Badges Act, to hire more BIA police officers to make it easier to do that. It's part of Savannah's Act to be able to share data. It's part of the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act, which will actually fund properly public safety in Indian country. And I mean, look, there are a lot of rural areas in this country, all over the place. And those people in rural communities, they matter just as much as anyone who lives in a city. So, yes, thank you. So there is a lot that needs to be done. But we need, when I mentioned that we passed the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2019, and it's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, I'm serious about this. He is shirking his responsibility as a United States Senator, because there are peoples whose lives will be saved by this bill. We should not be playing politics with any people's lives. And considering the fact that this issue right now is like, we're just finding out about it, right? Like, we went, you know, a Native woman could be murdered, kidnapped and murdered, and then they don't write about it in the newspaper for 2 weeks, right? People, like, it just wasn't, like, who cares? And so we are working hard to make sure that everybody cares. We're working hard to make sure that every single person in this United States cares about these issues. And when you get public support, you're more likely to get some things done. But that just gives you an idea of some of the things that we're doing. I had 2 amendments in the Violence Against Women Act. One, let me see if I can remember them. One gives funding to urban Indians in state courts for victim advocate services, and then the other one allows Indian tribes to be eligible to receive or to apply for grants and get grant funding as well. So there are a lot of things everywhere, and we need to do all of it.
We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll have some time over reception for conversation.
Hello, my name is Maggie Dunn. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your words, and also to the organizers of this event for creating this space for this really important conversation. Many of my questions were actually very eloquently addressed by the last person who spoke, but I was actually going to ask about the Violence Against Women Act. I'm a Georgetown graduate student. For many years I worked on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And my understanding with the last iteration of the Violence Against Women Act was that there was a pilot provision for 3 separate federally recognized tribes to have increased authority in being able to prosecute violent crimes and sexual assault that took place by that were perpetrated by people who were not residents of the community. And I was just wondering, I'm look forward to helping use my voice to advocate for the reauthorization. I was wondering if there's anything to report regarding like whether that is also a conversation that or a priority going forward for tribal governments to have the ability to investigate those crimes, increase sovereignty to do so in collaboration with federal authorities, but just increasing those efforts.
Yes, it's everything. Everything is I think a priority. Absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, we're here. I have to say that Sharice Davids and I think we both experience the same thing. Our door is open, and we get visited by a lot of tribes across the country. It's not just my district, it's tribal nations from everywhere in the country. They come to our offices to visit with us about these issues. So, yes, it's all a priority, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And one more.
Hello, my name is Fatima. I'm from Mexico. And thinking about the question from my mom's sister, I want to ask you, how are you approaching this relationship between the land and the territory and the murder of indigenous women, not just as person in a material sense, but also as political subjects? And how are you also approaching the participation of other colonial agents that are not the state? For instance, in Mexico, indigenous women are being murdered by the drug trafficking groups. And how are you approaching this issue where the colonial violence is coming from other agents that are not the state and is close related with the defense of the territory and the land? Thank you.
I can speak a little bit to what some of our calls for justice in the Canadian National Inquiry, because we did look at issues in relation to the land protection and the extraction industry. There's a correlation between the extraction industry and violence experienced by Indigenous women in the surrounding areas. And when you spoke, I want to thank you for your comments. It reminded me of a teaching I received from an elder through the inquiry, which was that what's happening to the land is what's happening to the women. And we have to be talking about land as well as violence towards the land, as well as violence towards women. I think with respect to this question about land and how the state can take action to address issues of violence against the land and women, because it's correlated, we did call for amendments to federal, provincial, and territorial approval processes and review processes when it comes to projects across the country, to employ like a gendered and feminist and intersecting Indigenous impact assessments, and that being mandatory before approvals are provided, and means to mitigate. So those things, I think, that where the state has control, that is one example of a mechanism that we have put our voice behind. In Canada, the drug issue isn't as pervasive. It's not one that we were exposed to, particularly in course of the inquiry, but we did hear extensively about human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and that is somewhat parallels the question you gave with respect to drugs. I mean, this again it's an intersecting and multifaceted issue, and we call on the private sector. Hotels, transportation services have a huge responsibility in becoming aware and identifying how their industries are tools and vehicles for human trafficking and sexual exploitation, as well as the child welfare system, how that interconnects with it. I'm not sure, but this answers your question on point, but these are some considerations we had in the course of our work and our analysis.
we're slightly over time. I want to thank the kind AV people who have stayed with us, as well as volunteers who are assembling the reception in the Galleria. I invite you to join us over some refreshments that are native food inspired. And Congresswoman Haaland, I'd like to mention that we have a guest who came all the way from New Mexico here, Nichelle Salazar. So be sure to greet each other in your homeland. And I look forward to seeing you on the reception. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.